What if the person everyone walked past was the one who would quietly change a billionaire family's future forever? The rain had been falling over Cedar Ridge, Colorado, for nearly 3 hours, turning the quiet downtown streets into ribbons of silver beneath the yellow glow of aging streetlights. Most people hurried from one warm building to another without lifting their eyes, eager to escape the cold spring storm before it soaked through their coats. Ethan Brooks wasn't in a hurry. He never really was. After another 12-hour shift at Miller's Auto Repair, his jeans carried the familiar scent of motor oil. His hands were rough from tightening bolts all day, and exhaustion rested on his shoulders like an old friend that refused to leave. Yet every evening, before driving home to his 8-year-old daughter, Lily, he made the same slow trip through Main Street, believing that kindness often lived in the places everyone else ignored. His old Ford F-150 rolled quietly through the rain until something unusual caught his attention near the bus stop across from an abandoned bookstore. A young woman sat alone on the wet sidewalk, her back against the brick wall, her shoes half submerged in a puddle as rainwater soaked the sleeves of her simple gray sweater. People walked around her without stopping. One man glanced over before shaking his head. A couple whispered something to each other and continued toward their SUV. Someone else lifted a phone for a brief second, then laughed softly before disappearing into the rain. Ethan slowed his truck. He watched for another moment. Maybe she was waiting for someone. Maybe she wanted to be left alone. But then he saw her shoulders trembling from the cold, and he noticed the untouched umbrella lying several feet away as though it had been dropped without anyone bothering to pick it up. He parked along the curb, pulled on his worn brown jacket, and stepped into the rain. "Ma'am?" he called gently, careful not to startle her. She didn't answer. He moved closer until he could see her face beneath strands of rain-soaked dark hair. She looked young, no older than 30. Her eyes were half closed, unfocused, carrying the distant confusion of someone overwhelmed rather than dangerous. The faint scent of alcohol lingered in the cold air, but what Ethan noticed most wasn't the smell. It was the sadness, the kind that settled so deeply inside a person that even silence seemed too heavy to carry. "Hey," he said again, kneeling several feet away to give her space. "Can you tell me your name?" Her lips moved before a whisper finally escaped. "Claire." Then nothing. Ethan looked around. No friends. No family. No one searching for her. Only passing headlights reflecting across the wet pavement before vanishing into the darkness. He thought about Lily waiting at home, probably curled beneath her favorite blanket while finishing another chapter of the adventure book they had started reading together. He thought about the promise he had made to his late wife 5 years earlier, that no matter how hard life became, he would never let bitterness decide who he became. He sighed quietly, removed his jacket, and gently placed it across Claire's shoulders. "You're freezing," he said softly. "Come on, let's get you somewhere warm." Claire barely looked up, her tired eyes searching his face as though she couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to her without expecting something in return. She gave his smallest nod. Ethan offered his hand, not demanding trust, only offering it. After a long pause, her trembling fingers reached toward his. Neither of them knew that before the next sunrise, black luxury SUVs would begin searching every road in Colorado. Neither of them knew that one quiet decision made beneath an ordinary rainstorm was about to collide with one of the wealthiest families in America. But for Ethan Brooks, none of that mattered. At that moment, she wasn't a headline. She wasn't someone's missing daughter. She was simply another human being standing alone in the rain, and he refused to let kindness become another thing the world walked past. The heater inside Ethan's old pickup hummed softly as they drove through the rain, pushing back just enough of the chill to make the silence feel gentle instead of awkward. Claire rested against the passenger door with her eyes closed, her breathing slow but uneven, as though every mile carried her farther from a burden she could not explain. Ethan did not ask where she had been or why she had been sitting alone outside. Experience had taught him that wounded people often needed warmth before questions. 20 minutes later, the truck turned onto a quiet gravel driveway where a modest white farmhouse stood beneath towering pine trees. The porch light glowed against the darkness, and one small window upstairs remained lit. Lily was still awake. Before Ethan even reached the front steps, the front door opened. The little girl stood there wearing oversized blue pajamas covered with tiny stars, clutching a stuffed rabbit beneath one arm. "Daddy, you are late," she said with a sleepy smile before noticing the woman beside him. Her curious eyes widened, but there was no fear in them, only concern. "Is she okay?" Ethan nodded gently. "She has had a very difficult night. Let's help her get warm." Lily stepped aside without another question. Their home was small, with creaking wooden floors, faded family photographs on the walls, and the comforting smell of cinnamon drifting from a slow cooker Ethan had prepared before leaving for work that morning. It was not a fancy house, but every corner carried evidence of love carefully maintained through difficult years. Claire looked around with quiet confusion, almost as if she had forgotten what an ordinary home felt like. Ethan guided her toward the couch while Lily hurried into the kitchen. A minute later, she returned carrying a steaming mug with both hands. "Hot chocolate," she whispered proudly. "Daddy always makes this when I have a bad day." Claire stared at the cup for several seconds before wrapping her cold fingers around it. The warmth reached her hands first. Then something softer reached her expression. She managed the faintest smile. "Thank you." Lily smiled back as though those two words were more than enough. Ethan found one of his late wife's old knitted blankets folded neatly inside the hallway closet. He hesitated for only a moment before placing it carefully across Claire's shoulders. The blanket still carried the gentle scent of lavender from years ago, a memory Ethan had never been able to wash away completely. Claire closed her eyes as she pulled it closer, and for the first time that evening her tense shoulders slowly relaxed. Outside, the rain continued tapping against the windows while the old clock above the fireplace marked each passing second with patient rhythm. Inside, nobody rushed the silence. Lily quietly curled into the armchair with her favorite storybook, occasionally glancing toward Claire with innocent concern. Ethan stirred a pot of homemade chicken soup before setting a warm bowl on the coffee table. "You do not have to explain anything tonight," he said softly. "Eat a little if you can. Tomorrow will still be there when the sun comes up." Claire looked at him, surprised by words that carried no judgment, no suspicion, and no expectation. She lowered her eyes, fighting emotions she had buried beneath years of polished smiles and carefully rehearsed conversations. In a world where almost everyone wanted something from someone else, this tire mechanic had offered shelter without asking for her last name, her past, or even a reason. She took one careful spoonful of soup, and although it was simple, it tasted like something she had not found in a very long time. It tasted like home. Morning arrived with pale sunlight spilling through the kitchen windows, washing the old farmhouse in gentle shades of gold. The storm had disappeared during the night, leaving tiny drops of water sparkling on the pine branches outside. Ethan was already awake, packing Lily's lunch with a quiet routine that had shaped every weekday since his wife passed away. Peanut butter sandwiches, apple slices, a handwritten note folded neatly inside the paper bag. Some traditions cost almost nothing, yet they carried more love than money could ever measure. Claire stepped carefully into the kitchen, wearing one of Ethan's clean flannel shirts with the sleeves rolled to her wrists. She looked rested, but there was still uncertainty behind her eyes. "Good morning," she said softly. Ethan smiled as he poured fresh coffee into a plain ceramic mug. "Good morning. There is breakfast if you are hungry." Lily looked up from the table and grinned. "Daddy makes the best pancakes in Colorado." Ethan laughed quietly. "That is a very generous review for my only customer." For the first time since Ethan had found her in the rain, Claire laughed too. It was brief, almost hesitant, but it filled the room with a warmth that lingered long after the sound had faded. Breakfast unfolded without uncomfortable questions. They talked about Lily's spelling test, the robin building a nest outside the porch, and the old Labrador next door that somehow escaped every Saturday morning only to return home before dinner. Claire listened more than she spoke, Yet Ethan noticed something unusual. Her grammar was polished. Her vocabulary was precise. Even the way she thanked Lily for passing the syrup carried effortless elegance that did not match someone who had spent the previous evening alone on a sidewalk. After dropping Lily off at school, Ethan returned to find Claire quietly washing the breakfast dishes. "You did not have to do that," he said. She smiled without turning around. "You opened your home to a stranger. Washing dishes seems like a very small thank you." Ethan simply nodded. He had learned years ago that kindness should never become an argument. As the day passed, Claire insisted on helping around the house. She folded laundry with remarkable care, organized a cluttered bookshelf, and even repaired the loose hinge on an old kitchen cabinet using a screwdriver she found in Ethan's garage. When she finished, the cabinet closed perfectly. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You have done that before." Claire paused for only a second. "Someone once taught me that little problems become expensive when people ignore them." It sounded less like an answer and more like a memory. Later that afternoon, while Ethan replaced worn brake pads on his pickup, Claire wandered through the garage. Her eyes stopped on an old framed photograph sitting above the workbench. It showed Ethan beside his late wife, both smiling as they held newborn Lily wrapped in a pink blanket. Claire picked up the frame gently. "She had kind eyes," she whispered. Ethan looked at the photograph before returning to his work. She believed every person deserved to be treated with dignity, especially on their worst day. Claire lowered the picture carefully back onto the shelf. The words settled deep inside her heart because they described exactly what Ethan had done for her without ever realizing it. As evening approached, the peaceful rhythm of the little farmhouse continued, but somewhere nearly 100 miles away, inside a towering glass headquarters overlooking downtown Denver, conference rooms remained filled with anxious executives, unanswered phone calls, and growing fear. A powerful family was searching every airport, every hotel, and every highway for a missing daughter. Yet the woman they could not find was quietly helping a little girl finish her homework at a worn wooden kitchen table, smiling as though she had finally discovered something far more valuable than the world she had disappeared from. The following morning settled over Cedar Ridge with the quiet confidence of a town that believed every day would look much like the last. The air smelled of fresh pine and damp earth as Ethan headed to the garage for another day of work, leaving Claire with a simple request. "There is no pressure to stay," he said while picking up his lunchbox. "But if you are still here this evening, Lily will probably ask you to help with another spelling quiz." Claire smiled softly. "I think I would like that." After his truck disappeared down the gravel driveway, she stood alone on the front porch, listening to birds singing from the towering trees. It had been years since she had experienced a morning without assistants checking schedules, ringing phones, security briefings, or meetings planned down to the minute. The silence felt unfamiliar, yet strangely comforting. Inside the farmhouse, she noticed a loose button hanging from one of Lily's school sweaters. Without thinking, she found a sewing kit tucked inside an old kitchen drawer and carefully stitched it back into place. Every movement reminded her of afternoons long ago with her grandmother, before life became measured by headlines, boardrooms, and expectations. When Lily returned home from school that afternoon, she immediately noticed the repaired sweater. "You fixed it," she said with bright eyes. Claire nodded. It only needed a little patience. Lily wrapped her arms around Claire in a quick, innocent hug before running to show Ethan a perfect score on her spelling test. Ethan looked from the paper to Claire and quietly smiled. He was beginning to notice that nothing about her matched the story she seemed determined not to tell. She knew how to prepare homemade bread from scratch, yet she could also identify rare classical composers playing softly on the old radio. She folded clothes with military precision, corrected Lily's grammar with remarkable kindness, and somehow carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to making important decisions. None of it fit together, but Ethan never asked. That evening, after dinner, Claire offered to wash the dishes while Ethan and Lily planted tomato seedlings behind the house. As she rolled up her sleeves, something slipped from the pocket of the borrowed flannel shirt and landed quietly on the kitchen floor. It was a delicate silver key card attached to a leather tag embossed with a gold letter H. Claire froze. Her expression changed for the first time since arriving at the farmhouse. She quickly picked it up and closed her hand around it just as Ethan stepped back inside, carrying a watering can. "Everything all right?" he asked. She forced a calm smile. "Yes, I just dropped something." Ethan accepted the answer without another question. Later that night, after Lily had gone to bed, Claire stood alone on the porch beneath a sky crowded with stars. She removed a small cellular phone from the bottom of her handbag. The battery still held a little power. More than 80 missed calls covered the screen. Dozens of messages remained unopened. The contact listed simply as mother appeared again and again beside urgent notifications from attorneys, executives, and security personnel. Claire stared at the display while her thumb hovered above the call button. One touch would bring helicopters, bodyguards, reporters, and the complicated life she had fled only days earlier. Behind her, she heard the front door open. Ethan stepped outside carrying 2 mugs of warm tea. He handed one to her without looking at the phone she had already slipped back into her pocket. "Beautiful night," he said quietly. Claire looked across the peaceful fields where fireflies drifted above the grass like tiny floating lanterns. "Yes," she whispered. "It is." Somewhere beyond those dark mountains, search teams continued following every possible lead, believing they were getting closer with each passing hour. Yet the one person they desperately wanted to find stood beneath a sky full of stars, silently wondering whether she had finally found the one place where nobody cared about her last name. The next few days passed with a peaceful rhythm that felt almost unreal. Every morning, Ethan drove Lily to school before heading to the repair shop. And every afternoon he returned to find laughter waiting inside the little farmhouse instead of the silence that had filled it for years. Claire found herself slipping naturally into their routine without ever intending to. She watered the tomato seedlings before sunrise, baked fresh biscuits using an old recipe she remembered from childhood, and listened patiently as Lily practiced reading aloud from her favorite library books. It was the kind of ordinary life Claire had never realized she had been missing. One afternoon, Ethan arrived home carrying a small paper bag from the local grocery store. "I brought your favorite apples," Lily announced excitedly before stopping in front of Claire. "Well, they're my favorite, but I think they might become yours too." Claire accepted the bright red apple with a smile that reached her eyes. "Thank you." Ethan leaned against the kitchen counter, watching the simple exchange. He could not explain why seeing the two of them together made the house feel whole again. He quickly pushed the thought aside. Life had taught him not to build dreams faster than reality. Later that evening, while Lily worked on a science project at the dining table, the television quietly played local news in the background. Ethan barely noticed until the anchor's serious voice changed the mood inside the room. Authorities continue searching for Claire Harrington, the missing daughter of business leader Victoria Harrington, chief executive officer of Harrington Global. The family has offered a substantial reward for information leading to her safe return after she disappeared 4 days ago. A photograph appeared on the screen. Claire stood confidently beside her mother at a charity event, wearing an elegant navy blue dress beneath the flashing lights of countless cameras. Ethan slowly turned toward the living room. Claire had frozen where she stood, the color fading from her face. Their eyes met across the room, and neither of them spoke. Lily looked back and forth between them before whispering, "Daddy, that looks like Claire." The silence stretched for several long seconds. Outside, the evening wind rustled through the pine trees while the old grandfather clock quietly marked another passing moment. Ethan reached for the remote control and gently turned off the television. He looked at Claire, not with suspicion, not with anger, but with the same calm kindness she had first seen on that rainy night. "You do not have to explain anything until you are ready," he said softly. Claire blinked in disbelief. "You are not going to ask me if it is true." Ethan shook his head. "If you want me to know, you will tell me. If you are not ready, then I will wait." Claire lowered herself into a chair as tears quietly filled her eyes. She had spent most of her life surrounded by people demanding answers, making assumptions, or expecting explanations before offering compassion. Yet this man, who had every reason to question her, simply chose trust. After Lily went upstairs for bed, Claire finally broke the silence. "I did not run away because I hated my family," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just forgot who I was beneath everything people expected me to be." Ethan listened without interrupting. "Some days," he replied gently, "the bravest thing a person can do is stop running long enough to remember who they really are." Claire looked toward the dark window, where her reflection appeared beside the warm glow of the farmhouse. For the first time since leaving Denver, she realized she was no longer afraid of being found. She was only afraid of losing the quiet little family that had reminded her what genuine kindness looked like before the rest of the world came searching. The following afternoon arrived with clear blue skies stretching endlessly above the Colorado mountains, but an unusual stillness settled over the farmhouse long before anyone understood why. Ethan had taken the afternoon off after Lily's teacher invited parents to a small spring art display at the elementary school. The three of them spent the morning planting flowers along the front porch, laughing whenever Lily insisted every flower needed its own name before it could grow properly. Claire knelt beside her in the soft dirt, brushing loose strands of hair behind her ear as she helped place the last small daisy into the ground. For a brief moment, life felt beautifully ordinary. Then a distant sound drifted across the valley. Engines. Not one or two, but several moving together. Ethan slowly stood and looked toward the gravel road leading to the property. A line of black sport utility vehicles appeared between the pine trees, their polished exteriors reflecting the afternoon sun. They moved slowly, deliberately, before stopping one by one outside the farmhouse. The sudden silence that followed felt heavier than the sound of the engines themselves. Lily instinctively reached for Ethan's hand. Claire closed her eyes for just a second, as though she had always known this moment would eventually arrive. The first vehicle door opened. Several professionally dressed security personnel stepped out, scanning the quiet property without raising their voices or creating panic. Finally, the rear door of the last vehicle opened, and an elegant woman in her late 50s emerged wearing a simple cream-colored suit instead of the powerful image usually seen on magazine covers. Victoria Harrington looked nothing like the commanding business leader the world admired. Her shoulders carried the weight of countless sleepless nights, and the moment her eyes found Claire standing on the porch, every trace of executive composure disappeared. "Claire," she whispered. Claire took one slow step forward before stopping. Tears filled both women's eyes at the same instant. Without another word, Victoria crossed the yard with surprising speed and wrapped her daughter in a long embrace that neither of them seemed willing to end. No reporters were present. No cameras flashed. Only the quiet sound of two people finally finding each other again after days of fear and uncertainty. Ethan remained beside Lily, giving them the privacy that reunion deserved. He lowered his eyes, believing this was a family moment that did not belong to him. A few minutes later, Victoria gently stepped back, brushing tears from her face before turning toward Ethan. Her gaze moved across the modest farmhouse, the freshly planted flowers, the old pickup truck parked beside the garage, and finally the knitted blanket still folded over the porch swing. Every detail silently answered questions she had been asking herself for days. She walked toward Ethan with measured steps. "You are Ethan Brooks," she said softly. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Victoria extended both hands instead of offering the formal handshake everyone expected from a billionaire chief executive officer. "Thank you for bringing my daughter somewhere that reminded her how kindness feels." Ethan looked almost uncomfortable receiving such gratitude. Anyone would have done the same. Victoria slowly shook her head. "No," she replied with quiet certainty. Many people saw her that night. Only one person stopped. Those simple words settled over everyone standing in the yard. Even the security team lowered their eyes with quiet respect. Lily looked up at her father with a smile that carried innocent pride. Claire watched Ethan standing there in his faded work jeans, saying nothing to draw attention to himself, accepting neither praise nor recognition. In that peaceful afternoon light, Victoria realized that the greatest gift her daughter had found was not safety alone. It was a home where compassion had been offered freely, dignity had been protected without question, and love had quietly survived in the smallest acts of everyday life. Victoria accepted Ethan's invitation to step inside, leaving the security team respectfully outside near the vehicles. The moment she crossed the threshold, she stopped without saying a word. Her eyes wandered slowly across the modest living room where family photographs lined the mantel, children's drawings covered one side of the refrigerator, and an old rocking chair sat beside the fireplace with a folded lavender blanket resting across its back. Nothing inside the farmhouse carried luxury, yet everything reflected care. It was the kind of home built one quiet sacrifice at a time. Lily disappeared into her bedroom and returned carrying a stack of colorful drawings. "Miss Claire helped me finish these," she said proudly before handing one to Victoria. The picture showed 3 people planting flowers beneath a bright yellow sun. One figure had dark hair like Claire. Another wore Ethan's familiar brown jacket. The smallest figure held both of their hands. Across the top, written in careful second-grade handwriting, were the words, "The best garden grows with kindness." Victoria looked at the drawing for several seconds before quietly wiping another tear from her cheek. She could not remember the last time her daughter had smiled so naturally in any photograph taken at one of their elegant estates. Claire noticed her mother's expression and gently touched her arm. "I laughed here," she whispered. "Not because anyone expected me to, just because I wanted to." Victoria slowly nodded. "I can see that." She turned toward Ethan again. "May I ask you something?" Ethan set 3 mugs of coffee on the kitchen table before taking a seat across from her. "Of course." Victoria folded her hands together. "When you recognized Claire on the news, why did you not call the reward number?" Ethan looked genuinely surprised by the question. "Because she was not ready to leave." Victoria remained silent. Ethan continued in the same calm voice that had never once sought praise. "She was safe. She was eating. She was smiling again. Money could wait. Healing could not." The room became very still. Even Claire lowered her eyes as those words settled gently into her heart. Victoria took a slow breath before asking another question. "Did she ever tell you who she really was?" Ethan smiled faintly. "She told me her first name on the night we met. Everything else belonged to her until she decided otherwise." Victoria glanced around the room once more. There were no photographs secretly taken for profit, no news reporters waiting outside, no signs that anyone had tried to take advantage of the situation. Instead, she noticed Lily's homework spread across the dining table beside, Claire's neat handwriting, fresh bread cooling on the kitchen counter, and a repaired flower pot that had obviously been glued back together rather than replaced. Every small detail spoke the same quiet language of gratitude instead of greed. Claire reached into her pocket and placed the silver key card with the gold letter H onto the table. "I carry this everywhere because I thought it opened every important door in my life," she said softly. Then she looked toward Ethan. "But this house opened something much more valuable." Ethan lowered his eyes, uncomfortable being placed at the center of such praise. Sometimes people simply need a place where nobody expects them to be anything except themselves. Victoria looked at him with a respect that no business meeting had ever earned. She had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions, advised presidents, and stood before thousands of shareholders without hesitation. Yet sitting inside this quiet farmhouse, she realized that the greatest measure of success had never been found inside boardrooms or financial reports. It lived in ordinary people whose character remained steady even when nobody important was watching. And in that quiet realization, her understanding of wealth began to change forever. Victoria remained seated at the kitchen table for a long moment before quietly reaching into the leather portfolio one of her assistants had carried inside. She removed a neatly prepared envelope and gently slid it across the worn wooden surface toward Ethan. "This is only a small expression of my gratitude," she said. "Inside is enough to pay off your home, provide for Lily's education, replace your truck, and ensure that neither of you ever has to worry about another bill again." Ethan looked at the unopened envelope but made no effort to touch it. The room grew, silent except for the distant singing of birds outside the open kitchen window. Claire watched him carefully, almost holding her breath. She knew exactly how much money rested inside that envelope. She also knew that very few people had ever declined anything offered by Victoria Harrington. Ethan finally looked up with the same calm expression that had never changed since the rainy night they first met. "Your generosity means more than I can say," he replied softly. "But I cannot accept it." Victoria blinked in surprise. "You saved my daughter." Ethan gently shook his head. "I gave someone a warm place to sleep. Any father should have done the same." Victoria leaned forward. "Not everyone would have." Ethan smiled kindly. "Perhaps not, but I still cannot place a price on something that should have been given freely." Claire lowered her eyes as emotion quietly filled them again. Every word confirmed what she had slowly discovered during her stay. Ethan did not measure people by wealth, and he did not measure kindness by reward. Victoria hesitated before asking, "Then tell me what I can do for you. There must be something your family needs." Ethan glanced toward the staircase where Lily's laughter drifted faintly from her bedroom as she played with a small puzzle Claire had bought from the local gift shop. He smiled before answering. "There's only one thing I would ask." Victoria nodded immediately. "Anything." Ethan looked first at Claire and then back to her mother. "When Claire decides where she belongs, let it be her decision. Do not ask her to become who everyone expects before she has the chance to remain who she has rediscovered here." The words settled over the room with quiet weight. Claire covered her mouth as tears slipped down her cheeks. Victoria slowly turned toward her daughter and truly looked at her, not as the future leader of a global company, not as the face of a powerful family, but simply as the little girl she had once carried through a garden many years before success had consumed every calendar and every conversation. She reached across the table and gently held Claire's hand. "I spent so many years preparing you to inherit my world," she whispered. "I forgot to ask whether it was the world your heart wanted." Claire squeezed her mother's hand. "I never wanted to disappoint you." Victoria smiled through her tears. "You never did. I simply forgot that love should never feel like another responsibility." She quietly closed the envelope and returned it to her portfolio. Then she stood, walked around the table, and embraced Ethan with the gratitude of a mother rather than the authority of a chief executive officer. "You have given my daughter something I could not buy with every dollar I have ever earned," she said. You reminded her that she was enough before the world placed expectations on her shoulders. Ethan smiled with quiet humility. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give another person is permission to rest. As the afternoon sunlight poured through the farmhouse windows, nobody spoke for several moments. In that peaceful silence, every person in the room understood that true wealth had never entered the house inside a luxury vehicle. It had already been living there in simple acts of kindness, shared meals, honest words, and a father who quietly chose compassion even when nobody knew who was watching. 1 year passed with the quiet certainty that true change rarely arrived with loud applause. Seasons moved across the Colorado hills. The tomato plants grew tall beside the farmhouse porch, and Lily proudly announced to anyone who would listen that she was now old enough to beat her father at checkers at least once every weekend. Life remained simple. Ethan still worked at the same repair shop, still drove the same aging pickup truck, and still believed that an honest day's work was something to be grateful for. The only difference was that the silence inside the house no longer felt lonely. It felt hopeful. Claire had returned to Denver after leaving the farmhouse, not because she wanted to reclaim the life she had escaped, but because there were conversations she could no longer avoid. Over the following months, Harrington Global quietly changed in ways few people understood. Victoria reduced her schedule, delegated more authority, and launched new community programs that focused on family shelters, education, and mental health support instead of public recognition. Whenever journalists asked what had inspired the sudden changes, she simply smiled and replied that sometimes the greatest lessons came from ordinary people living extraordinary lives. Ethan never knew his influence had reached that far. One warm Saturday afternoon, As golden sunlight settled gently across the fields, Lily looked through the front window and suddenly gasped. "Daddy, someone is here." Ethan stepped onto the porch, expecting to see a neighbor. Instead, a single silver sedan rolled slowly into the driveway. There were no black sport utility vehicles, no security personnel, no assistants carrying folders. The driver stepped out alone. Claire closed the car door, wearing blue jeans, comfortable boots, and a light cream sweater that looked far more like the woman who had laughed around Ethan's kitchen table than the executive often photographed in national magazines. She carried only a small overnight bag and a carefully wrapped gift box tied with a simple ribbon. Ethan smiled warmly. "Welcome back." Claire smiled in return. "Thank you for letting me come home." The word home lingered in the quiet afternoon air. Lily ran across the yard before Claire even reached the porch. The little girl wrapped both arms around her, laughing so brightly that birds scattered from the nearby fence. Claire knelt down and hugged her just as tightly. Then, instead of standing immediately, she remained on one knee and gently placed the small gift box on the ground. "Lily," she said softly, her voice trembling with honest emotion, "there is something I have wanted to ask you for a very long time." Lily looked at her with wide, curious eyes. Claire took a slow breath. "Would you give me the chance to earn the privilege of becoming part of your family? I cannot replace your mother, and I would never try. But if your heart ever has room for me, I would love to spend my life caring for you and your father." Lily did not answer with words. She simply threw her arms around Claire once again and held on with all the strength a child's grateful heart could give. Ethan quietly looked toward the sky, blinking away tears he had not expected. Victoria had once told him that money could solve almost every problem. Standing there beneath the warm Colorado sun, watching the two people he loved embrace without a single promise of wealth or status between them, he finally understood something even greater. Kindness offered without expectation has a way of returning in forms no one could ever predict. Some people spend their lives searching for fortune. Others discover that the richest blessings arrive on rainy nights, hidden inside ordinary moments, waiting for one compassionate person willing to stop when everyone else keeps walking. And as the evening light settled gently over the little farmhouse, three hearts stood together in peaceful silence, proving that dignity, grace, second chances, and love will always outlast power, titles, and fortune.